Right. So the three-year-long Dunnes dispute, which ran from between 1984 and 1987, has become quite totemic, both in the memory of Irish trade unionism and in the history of the sort of global solidarity movement against apartheid in South Africa. Beginning with a walkout by a handful of young, predominantly female employees at Dunn's Henry Street branch in Dublin in July 1984, after Mary Manning, a 21-year-old cashier and trade unionist, refused to handle a South African grapefruit, and ending with a ban on the importation of South African fruit and vegetables by the Irish government. It's far and away the most recognised manifestation of Irish anti-apartheid activism and has been celebrated in story and song. Yet it wasn't, as some popular media accounts seem to portray it, a naive, spontaneous manifestation, and nor was it unanimously supported even by some of apartheid's professed opponents, who would often like us to think that they were behind the Dunnes movement from the beginning. So I want to talk a little bit about the origins and development of the strike and some elements of its domestic and international context. For the first half of this talk, I'm going to delve fairly deeply into the world of Irish trade unionism in the early 80s and try and place the strike a little bit in the industrial climate of the time. In 1980, union membership in Ireland hit a historic high as a percentage of the workforce. It actually surpassed the peak in Britain, which is a figure all the more remarkable when you think that Ireland was a less industrialised economy. There were fewer large industrial workplaces, which at the time in Britain were still fairly dominant within the labour movement. The largest industrial dispute the Irish state had seen in the preceding decade was probably the sort of various bank worker strikes that took place between 1966 and 76. The longest of which in 1970 had closed every bank in the state for 6 months. One young trade unionist who came to some prominence during the bank workers' strike was John Mitchell, who, as a full-time official, then led the pursuit of a court case against the County Dublin firm Linson, which made sex discrimination in pension schemes illegal in Ireland for the first time. Poor relationship with the union's London-based centre led him to move on in 1977 to become General Secretary of the Electrical Supply Board Officers Union, which was a small union that represented clerical staff at the ESB. Only had about 1,000 or so members. During his 4 years there, the union wasn't really involved in any major disputes. The government backed down in fear of power cuts, the closest they came to one in 1980, but his reputation continued to grow. The union also gained some positive publicity for working with Trócaire, the Catholic Church's development agency, to collect over £20,000 for famine victims in Kampuchea. And Mitchell became chair of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions Third World Committee. What was then called the Irish Union of Distributive Workers and Clerks, the IUDWC, was the third largest union in the country, but was characterised by the Irish edition of Socialist Worker in 1980 as probably the most conservative of all trade unions, its leaders hand in hand with the management in all the major Dublin stores. Its General Secretary was Billy Fitzpatrick, who'd been in office since 1954. Fitzpatrick saw his role as guarding against what he saw as the infiltration of the trade union movement by disruptive left-wing elements with dubious loyalties. He regularly invited Catholic priests onto union platforms to share the church's perspective on labour matters with members. In many sectors, it was beginning to hemorrhage members to the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Not a radical union by any means, but one which had at least showed some openness to industrial action. The final straw for Fitzpatrick, which effectively forced his retirement, came when the union's entire insurance industry section, with about 1,500 members, departed for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union en masse, after the union executive declined to defend a High Court appeal against an equal pay order which was made in favour of its own female members. Mitchell's election to succeed him was something of a surprise for observers of a union which one newspaper commentator called at the time the most moderate union in the world. He was a headhunted external candidate. He was a Corkman, a traditionally Dublin-dominated union. At 36 years old, he was less than half Fitzpatrick's age, and most significantly, he had a reputation as being a tough and radical organiser. He saw an opportunity for the union to arrest its decline in the rapid growth of the supermarket sector. where the IUDWC was still the largest union among the overwhelmingly young female workforce. Organising in traditional small family-run independent retailers, where small cohorts of staff could be easily cowed, intimidated, and if need be quickly replaced, had always been difficult. The supermarket, on the other hand, was far more akin to a large industrial employer. Large-scale disputes could generate disruption on a national level, attract widespread media attention, and ultimately be resolved quickly in members' favour without subsequent recriminations. The radical transformation Mitchell sought to bring to the union went against the grain of the prevailing trend in the Irish trade union movement. While the number of days that were lost to industrial action in 1983 was still very high compared to today, it was actually at its lowest for 15 years, and as we know, would continue to decline. The then Labour Minister, Liam Kavanagh, was hailing a new era of industrial relations, and Donal Nevin, the Irish Congress Trade Union's General Secretary, was seen by the government as a careful, thoughtful man from a civil service background. He was the key, as Mary talked about earlier today, he was the key ideological progenitor of the semi-corporate social partnership arrangement between government, private employer associations and trade unions, which drastically reduced industrial action later in the decade. Two largest supermarket chains in Ireland in the early 80s were the still extant Dunnes stores and Quinsworth, which was eventually absorbed into Tesco in the late 90s. Both were hostile to union organising, and the cautious approach of the old leadership had yielded few concessions. Ben Dunn Sr., the owner of Dunnes, was a particularly notorious individual, with an attitude towards trade unionism which, according to Mitchell, was more reminiscent of the 19th century than modern times. Coming from a union which largely organised skilled workers, he was shocked by a sector where the attitude of even the most enlightened employers that people should do what they're told, and there is no concept of consultation, participation, or workers having any rights. Under the new leadership, the union moved quickly to end its passive reputation. When Dunn refused to negotiate with the union on pay and conditions across the chain, the union moved forward on a local level instead. The first walkouts were at 4 stores in Cork over the large discrepancy in the rate paid to full-time and part-time staff. Many of the latter were short-term employees, some of them were only school children, and had only been recruited to the union the preceding months after Mitchell had taken over. Dunn's workers at a store in Waterford then joined the dispute after a spontaneous walkout over the abrupt dismissal of a member of staff. Management there quickly exacerbated the situation by trying to physically force scab labour through the picket line against the advice of Gardaí. After 3 weeks, the dispute escalated to a national level on the 21st of February, with demands being made for the resolution of the full-time part-time pay discrepancy, a national pay uplift, and full union recognition. With 1,500 staff out, every one of Dunn's 14 Dublin stores failed to open, as did the majority of stores outside the capital. Management responded bizarrely, ordering the several hundred staff in Dublin who had turned up to work to instead march to the IUDWC's office on Cavendish Row, and then to the headquarters of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, running a counter-picket demanding their right to work. When the talks were initiated, they predictably went nowhere until Dunn's, under pressure from suppliers, some of whom were going to be forced out of business by the ongoing dispute, agreed to refer the matter to the Labour Court. While I've yet to look at state papers to see if I can confirm my suspicion, I found some grounds to believe I think it's also possible that there may have been some form of discreet government intervention, fearing that the indefinite closure of Ireland's largest supermarket chain could cause a price spiral. The resulting ruling was largely in favour of the union, although Dunn's disregarded the recommendation for the establishment of a national disputes and grievance procedure. The influence of the 1983 national dispute on the anti-apartheid strike 18 months later is one that I would see as quite essential, but it seems to have been entirely overlooked thus far. It marked the abrupt pivot of Ireland's main shop workers' union from one of the most conservative in the country to one of the most radical. Frustration at the tepid support for the strike from some established shop stewards shifted their composition. Karen Gearan, the 21-year-old shop steward who walked out at Henry Street in 1984, was among the new crop. Theresa Mooney, one of the other anti-apartheid strikers, also acted as a picket line organiser during the 1983 dispute, and the majority of the anti-apartheid strikers were involved in some way or another. It also upped union penetration at Dunn's to above 90%. which was a remarkable figure for a low-wage employer with a predominantly young, female, and often transient workforce. The IUDWC, which changed its name to EDATU in 1984, was engaged in an unprecedented wave of activity. According to Mitchell, it paid out more strike pay in the 2 years in 1983 and 1984 than in the preceding 80. Major disputes took place at Quinsworth, Cleary's department store in O'Connell Street, and British Home Stores, as well as a raft of smaller localised ones. Another aspect of Mitchell's tenure which set him apart was the attention to social justice issues. He was far ahead of his time on LGBT rights. In an era when male homosexuality was still criminalised, he proposed a successful motion to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions on workplace discrimination and challenged the Congress when other unions failed to implement it. Workers at the Key Co-op, a Cork resource centre set up by gay and lesbian activists, were invited to join the union and given a platform in the Distributive Worker, the union's once sleepy newspaper. This is one aspect of Mitchell's work which has been given some attention in recent years in Kieran Rose's new pamphlet on Irish trade unions and the fight for LGBT equality, which I know Kieran is actually giving a talk on at the Irish Labour History Society this afternoon. Atypically for the Irish labour movement of the era, he also didn't shy away from the North. The traditional approach endorsed by the leadership of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions tended to be one of appeasing Protestant trade unionists north of the border, so as to keep them within an all-Ireland structure. Mitchell caused a rupture with this through his campaigning against abuses by the British Army and the RUC and the mistreatment of Republican prisoners in the H-blocks in Armagh. As well as moving into the north and challenging British-based unions for members, EDATU helped set up and fund unemployed workers' groups in nationalist working class areas. As an internationalist, he was revived and chaired the Irish Congress of Trade Unions Third World Committee and saw trade union internationalism not as something remote, but something that should be integrated into the union's shop floor work, something that could give hope to the workers, as this quote that I've used here shows. So the motion that led to the Dunnes Anti-Apartheid Strike was put to the Union's Congress by Brian Higgins, who was a Limerick-based friend and collaborator of Mitchell. Its wording, which urged unions and their members to boycott South African goods and to black, i.e. to refuse to handle them at points of import, distribution and sale, wasn't especially unique. It was really a restatement of something that had been the ICTU position adopted at Congress back in 1981. That motion had sat on the books for 3 years and had done very little. Various other Irish and British trade unions had adopted similar motions over the years and nothing was really being done with them. The difference was that EDATU, as the union had now been renamed, decided to communicate the position to its shop stewards with the instruction that it was going to be implemented upon the shop floor. The union's recent record of militancy had been enough that management elsewhere capitulated on the issue. Cleary's department stores took South African wine down from the shelves. Union staff at Quinsworth, which was Dunn's biggest rival, were given an opt-out from handling South African fruit. It was Dunn's typical contemptuous attitude towards its staff which led to them being the point of conflict. Karen Gearan said in a recent interview that we were following union instruction because we were treated so badly at work. If we'd been working in a nice environment, would we have taken that union instruction as seriously? I don't know, probably not. Gearan herself had recently been refused leave to attend her grandmother's funeral. From this point, the story is somewhat better known. I'll devote some time to summarising it for those of you who are not as familiar, but I would say that you can do little better than read Mary Manning's excellent memoir, Striking Back, which was published in 2017, which I've drawn upon extensively in my own work. When it began in July 1984, the strike was greeted with a wave of enthusiasm. The Irish anti-apartheid movement initially rallied its supporters to the picket line. It got a message to Bishop Desmond Tutu in Johannesburg, who then undertook a series of media interviews supporting and publicising the strike. Hopes of resolving the dispute were dashed in its early months as Ben Dunn Jr., his father having died the previous year, continued the family tradition of intransigence. The first round of negotiations in August went nowhere, and although a brief second round followed after Dunn unexpectedly walked into the union offices, barracking staff and refusing to leave until he spoke to Mitchell, the things continued to go nowhere. Dunn's best offer proved to be no more than a verbal undertaking that he wouldn't try to illegally dismiss the strikers if they were to return to work, with no conscience clause that would avoid a repeat of the dispute. The strikers were consulted and the offer duly rejected. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions refused to have Dunn's blacked, and thus other unions didn't instruct their members to cease deliveries. The Irish Transport and General Workers Union, who represented some of the lorry drivers, provided a token letter of support, but stopped short of giving their drivers an official instruction not to cross the pickets. This, which was combined with breakdown negotiations, convinced Kader Asmal from the Irish Anti-Apartheid movement that the strike was unwinnable. An approach to Mitchell and to the Duns Stores divisional organiser, Brendan Archibald, in October 1984 was rebuffed. Archibald subsequently recounted how he blocked a door in the union office, refusing to let Asmal leave until he verbally conceded that only a decision by the strikers of themselves would end the dispute, not backroom lobbying. But Asmal wasn't done. In the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement's archive in the National Library in Dublin, I discovered a letter that Asmal, seemingly acting alone because there was nothing in the minutes of the movement giving him authorisation to write this letter, a letter that Asmal had written to Ben Dunn. In it, he offered himself as a mediator alongside Eamon Casey, the Bishop of Galway and the chair of Trócaire. He explicitly distanced the anti-apartheid movement from the strike, emphasised that it wasn't of the movement's making, and expressed a desire to bring it to an end. If it continued, what he called dangerous tendencies could batten onto the dispute and, in his words, make matters uncontrollable. This letter was never disclosed to the strikers or to their union. The Dunnes Stores corporate archives are obviously very much close to researchers. Both Asmal and Dunn are since deceased. So all I can say is if there was a response, it was insufficient because no such negotiations ever took place. He does seem to have corresponded with Bishop Casey because in January 1985, when Casey was approached for a statement of support for the strikers, he instead told them that their dispute had been casually chosen and should be brought to a close. Asmal's position is something that's fascinated me. In his memoir, which he published in 2011, just before his death, he brushes over the issue altogether. There are a few brief pages that he gives the Dunn's dispute from the early, but it jumps from the very first months of the strike to the final sort of government ban on South African goods, which brought it to a close. Only two of the strikers are mentioned by name. No union official is mentioned at all. I don't think he even mentions the name of the strikers' union. It does strike me as revealing that the only other person he mentions by name is Marius Schoen, who was an exiled ANC member living in Dublin, noting Schoen's regular support of the pickets. Now, Marius Schoen was a heroic individual who sought asylum in Ireland after his wife and infant daughter were murdered in a letter bomb which had been sent to them by South African intelligence. But he wasn't the South African closest to the strikers, and also he hadn't arrived in Ireland until several months after the start of the dispute. The South African closest to the strikers was another man, Nimrod Sejake. He was older than Asmal and Schoen and had joined the ANC in 1949, just after the National Party had taken power, when it was still a legal organisation. An organiser in the segregated Iron Steel Workers Union in South Africa, he was a leading founder of the ANC-backed South African Congress of Trade Unions in 1955. In 1956, he'd become one of the 156 defendants in the 5-year treason trial. The treason trial accused are a who's who of prominent South African freedom fighters. Nelson Mandela, with whom Sejake shared a cell, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Joe Slovo, Ruth First, etc. Sejake eventually went into exile, but in Tanzania, where the ANC headquartered itself after it was banned, he was a victim of one of the ANC and South African Communist Party's many purges. After voicing opinions critical of the turn towards guerrilla warfare, which he saw coming at the expense of organising the black working class, he was expelled from the ANC and given 7 days to leave the country. He lived in nomadic, solitary exile, moving between various countries and becoming so overlooked by his former comrades that an official history of the South African Congress of Trade Unions mistakenly listed him as deceased. Asmal hadn't had much overlap with him. His political involvement in South Africa had only been minor, and he'd only joined the South African Communist Party after moving to London to pursue his legal studies. However, he soon became aware of him after Sejake arrived in Dublin in 1979, and, finding kindred spirits in the Trotskyist militant tendency, began to speak on their platforms on the anti-apartheid issue, and developed links with a sympathetic group of ANC dissidents in London. What becomes quite apparent if you sort of study the ANC and South African Communist Party in exile is that there was a very sort of low toleration for open political dissent, and the anti-apartheid organisations were expected to adhere fairly tightly to the official line. The so-called Gang of Four in London, with whom Sejake was linked, were expelled from the ANC. In Britain, the ANC also took a hard line against ex-political prisoner David Kitson and his wife Norma when they attempted to run for the executive of the anti-apartheid movement on a platform of giving more equal attention to other South African liberation groups and a tactical shift towards more disruptive protest. The suggestion which was made might have affected the fragile understandings with which the British government allowed the ANC to operate more or less unmolested in its activities. The radical City of London anti-apartheid group, which the Kitsons supported, was eventually expelled from the British anti-apartheid movement. And although its 3-year non-stop picket of the South African embassy in London for the release of Nelson Mandela became one of the most memorable episodes in the history of British anti-apartheid, it was never readmitted. But nonetheless, in Britain, there was still a degree of formal separation between the South African liberation organisations and the mostly British-led anti-apartheid movement. For example, the anti-apartheid movement in Britain made a formal protest when ANC members were fairly unceremoniously physically set about removing members of the Gang of Four from a public meeting. But in Ireland, the South African diaspora was very small. Asmal effectively operated as the leader of both the sort of political South African diaspora and of the anti-apartheid movement. He undoubtedly saw Ireland as his turf. So affiliates were discouraged from associating with unofficial campaigners, and in spite of Sejake being no less than Nelson Mandela's ex-cellmate, Asmal took exception when the youth wing of the Irish Labour Party invited him to speak at their conference, claiming he was not an authentic representative. When Letterkenny Trades Council in Donegal invited both of them to speak at the same meeting, Sejake fumed. Asmal fumed that Sejake was hostile and antagonistic to the forces of liberation in South Africa, and no, the Irish anti-apartheid movement would under no circumstances share a platform with him. The influence of Sejake, whom Mary Manning in her memoir praises effusively as the striker's main political educator, was undoubtedly a serious concern for Asmal. His support was unstinting and constant, but left the strikers unmoored from the official ANC line. As if to emphasise that point, they developed links with the expelled City of London anti-apartheid group in Britain and organised a British tour without official anti-apartheid movement backing, in spite of attempts to derail it both from the anti-apartheid movement and from the British Shop Workers Union USDAL. It's understandable how the two groups, which are both pushed the margins of the official anti-apartheid movement, would find a level of natural kinship with each other. There's a further international factor which I think is of some significance, which brings me back round to the labour movement again. With the development of the new wave of independent trade unions in South Africa in the late 1970s, there was an increasing questioning of the continuing relevance of the ANC-affiliated SACTU, which the South African Congress of Trade Unions, which although it existed in exile, was largely supplanted at home. While the British TUC was always fairly hostile to SACTU because its international department, long controlled by the trade union right, saw it as too close to the Eastern Bloc, it did have a good amount of support from other trade unions. But increasingly, as the independent trade union in South Africa developed, unions which had backed SACTU enthusiastically began to look at building their own links with unions in South Africa instead. Some of the suspicion the ANC had of this was justified. There was a real potential that the new unions in South Africa would compromise with the regime in exchange for economic concessions for a limited section of the black working class. But it was coming clear over time that they represented a larger and larger constituency. Campaigning for so-called direct links between British and South African trade unions had been one of the factors which had got the London-based Gang of Four expelled from the ANC and SACTU's official publication subsequently ran with the headline, "Direct Links Stink." When the South African Mine Workers Union sent a delegation to show solidarity with British miners during the miners' strike, the ANC, SACTU and their allies applied pressure on Arthur Scargill and the MUM, who undoubtedly had better things to do with their time, not to afford the union delegation official status. But Asmal did have one ally. Donald Nevin and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions very much took his cue from there. And Asmal was able to boast that Nevin had done more for SACTU than any other trade union federation in Europe, in providing SACTU with funding and political legitimacy. In doing so, he was fulfilling what Asmal and many in the ANC saw as the primary function of the Western labour movement with regard to South Africa. Now, as we've already heard, Nevin certainly didn't see eye to eye with Mitchell and Idatu. He was also close to the Irish Labour Party, whose record in government Mitchell described as marginally to the left of the phalange. For one, Nevin was unhappy about the potential for Idatu's activities north of the border to alienate Protestant workers and destabilise relations with British trade unions. Whereas Mitchell's pursuit of a strategy of frequent industrial action also ran counter to Nevin's vision of a grand social compact with government and private employers. And ultimately, he seems to have possessed a genuine ideological hostility to the nature of the dispute, which had gone beyond being about the suspension of a single employee. He saw a move into issues of conscience like South African produce as far beyond the scope of the trade union movement, and when approached by several of the strikers as to why he'd failed to mention the Dunnes strikers when speaking at an Irish anti-apartheid movement event in March 1985, Nevin bluntly told them the strike wasn't working, wouldn't work, and that if other members took the same stand, where will it all end? Without Nevin's knowledge, Don Mullen from the Catholic NGO Action from Ireland recorded the conversation on tape, and then leaked the tape to a journalist, specifically to Eamon McCann, who was then writing for the Irish magazine McGill. The resulting article was an embarrassment for both Nevin and Asmal, and this seems to have marked their retreat from openly confronting the Dunnes strikers. And in spite of Nevin's predictions, the strike did begin to yield concrete results in the summer of 1985. Following a high-profile invitation from Archbishop Desmond Tutu to visit South Africa, where the strikers had been stopped at Johannesburg airport and deported, there was an escalation in pressure on the Irish government. Questions were asked in the Dáil as to whether the solely advisory approach taken towards Irish businesses trading with South Africa was sufficient. This prompted Labour Minister Ruairi Quinn to undertake direct discussions with Idatu and Dunnes, as well as initiating a separate investigation as to whether sanctions could be implemented on South African produce. As one would expect, the discussions with Dunnes again went nowhere because that's what they tended to do. But it was the latter channel that began to prove fruitful. And the picket at Henry Street was suspended in December 1985, 17 months after it started, although the strikers expressed their wish to continue. 2 months later, it was announced that the importation of South African goods to Ireland would be prohibited under the clause in the statutes of the International Labour Organization, which allowed states to ban the import of goods produced through prison labour, something utilised extensively under apartheid. However, Ireland continued to import South African produce for a further 12 months until the new restrictions were given legal sanction, which finally brought the dispute to a close. After the dispute came to a close, only some of the strikers returned to Dunnes. When arriving back, they were asked to sign a new contract, different from the contracts offered to any other Dunnes workers, which specifically instructed them that they must handle any goods that the chain had given them to sell. Karen Gearan was subsequently hounded out in 1988, although she successfully appealed her dismissal after being denied union representation. The same issue of the distributive worker, which recorded her victory in the appeal, announced Mitchell's termination as General Secretary. Tensions with the more conservative old guard on the union's executive had been an ever-present feature of his tenure, and had come to a head after Donald Nevin had suspended Idatu from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, after Mitchell gave an interview to a Belfast newspaper, decrying the British union USDA, with whom Idatu were locked in a dispute over members in the north, as useless, as an Uncle Tom reactionary union. The official grounds given were that Mitchell had allowed use of the union premises for a meeting at which Gerry Adams had spoken, in a climate where open affiliation to provisional Sinn Féin was still a taboo with the southern establishment. Although a lengthy campaign to reinstate him continued for several years and eventually led to the resignation of Mitchell's successor, he never worked in the trade union movement again. It should be noted that the years following the strike did see a degree of rapprochement between the Dunnes workers and the Irish anti-apartheid movement. They were given a place of honour during Nelson Mandela's 1990 visit to Dublin, which the movement organised. And in July 2008, in the photo I've got on the right there, Kader Asmal stood with Mary Manning as a plaque to the strike was involved outside Duns and Henry Street. Visiting from South Africa, he relayed a statement from Nelson Mandela, praising the workers who had refused to handle the fruits of apartheid 21 years ago in Dublin, and provided inspiration to millions of South Africans that ordinary people far away from the crucible of apartheid cared for our freedom. Nonetheless, Manning's 2017 memoirs are still critical of Asmal's role, suggesting that he was paralysed during the dispute because his aspirations of winning broad public support were tempered by a desire to remain ingratiated into the Irish political establishment and keep close to those who went to wine and cheese parties to support the anti-apartheid movement, but balked at protest and picket lines.